Hi y'all, welcome to another video. Today we're going to be talking about postcolonial studies and language, and we're going to be asking ourselves the question, what is the morally appropriate language in which to think and write, especially for postcolonial authors? And so I'm going to be discussing 4 different authors that are very relevant for this debate, and it's been going on since the 70s and 80s between Chinua Achebe and Ngugi. So the first author I will be discussing to lay the groundwork for this discussion is Ngugi. He's a famous Nigerian author, and he was responding to and critiquing Chinua Achebe's argument, and he urges African authors to write in their native languages as a necessary first step in resisting neocolonial rule, and he believes that language can be used as a tool of mental domination and colonization, and so he's urging people to write in their native languages. However, this does reinforce colonial binary thinking, which leads me to my next author, Chow. So the next author I will be discussing is Chow, and she directly challenges Ngugi's argument that you must use your native language while writing, and she views his approach to be an expression of nativist sentimentality that's impossible to return to, and she feels that it reinforces colonial binaries. And so instead of viewing multilingualism as language loss, Chow prefers the concept of the Xenophone, which I will define shortly. The Xenophone is an emergent languaging domain that bears in its accents the murmur, the passage of diverse found speeches. And so she also relies upon Walter Benjamin's concept of the aura to divert and mitigate this melancholia associated with language loss, and that way she's able to reframe language as dynamically embodying the traces of an anonymous collective and a world history that is constantly evolving. So, for example, right now what I'm holding in my hand is a piece of pottery that my grandmother brought back from the Czech Republic, which is where she's from. And if you can see, it has different designs on it and different like flowers and stuff like that. And so the markings on this piece of pottery, I'm not even sure, is it pottery? But this demonstrates the sense of the aura in the sense that it was passed down, but it also shows traces of different found markings of people who have used it in the past and people who have helped create this object. So the aura is collectively refashioned while having an enduring quality that defines it. And so language is similar to a piece of pottery in which traces of the potter can be found in its use as it's constantly evolving and being reshaped by different speakers. However, Chow views language as never originally native because there's no such thing as a true native speaker, because this relies on the exclusion of discontinuity from knowledge production. And so it gives this illusory sense of originality to the native speaker that they don't actually have, because liminality is intrinsic to language. For example, to be like a native English speaker, what does that even mean? Like, would you have to have a British accent to speak proper English? If you speak American English, is that not actual English? And for example, just the concept of like standard English wouldn't exist if it wasn't a part of the Germanic language family. It gets a lot of influence from the German language, and its proximity and distance from that language is what defines it as English. And so English is constantly evolving, and that's what I mean by the liminality of language. It's constantly changing, and so assigning anybody the status of a native speaker is inherently flawed, and it misrepresents the nature of language itself. Also, internet use constantly evolves language. Our language is changing with different internet slang and things like that. And so Chow optimistically views the Xenophone as a creative force that demonstrates the collective refashioning of postcolonial experience. However, despite the fact that the Xenophone is a very useful description and an accurate description of the postcolonial languaging scene, it has the potential for political oppression as much as it does liberation and emancipation, but all of this depends upon the positionality of the speaker or the author who uses the Xenophone. So now I will be discussing The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy, and she happened to be the winner of the Booker Prize, and her writing is used as an example of the Xenophone because she is trilingual in Malayalam, Hindi, and English, and those three languages are interweaved throughout this novel, and it really reflects Roy's multilingual and multicultural upbringing in India, especially the region of Kerala. And there's a lot of playful use of language because it's written from the perspective of two young twins. However, for example, the writing style is very unique. It uses a lot of compound words and epithets to describe their experience. For example, driftless driftwood. It's a very poetic book with a lot of color symbolism. For example, white grasshoppers with white wood violins, sad white music, a white wasp dead. There is, for example, that emphasis on whiteness and the conjunction between white and wood, creating a new compound word to describe something new. Language is constantly being played with, and she just will make words just string together. Like, for example, chipped enamel plates with dark blue rims were arranged. Just very focusing on color and focusing on symbolism, and it is a very playful use of different languages, but it's written entirely in English. Like, for example, if I could only speak Hindi or read Hindi, or if I could only read Malayalam and not English, I wouldn't be able to understand any of this book unless I had a translated copy. So it's written for a Western audience primarily, but it has been translated, of course, on an international scale, and it's been marketed internationally. And so Chow uses Roy as an example of how the Xenophone can be a tool for empowerment, because Roy refuses to write in her native language because that would limit her creative capacity. Also, Roy feels like she's from India, where there's over 700 languages, but only 2 languages are official. I believe it's Hindi and English in India, a place where there's over 700 different languages spoken in different regions. And so she's asking herself, what even is my native language? Her original language, she forgot how to speak, and then she learned Hindi and a different patois at university in Delhi. For her, and her use of language has been constantly evolving. She didn't have the privilege of getting to stick to her native language, whatever that means, or her native tongue. And so she refuses the moralization that's attached to language use by embracing a variety of languages and just playing with them and being creative with them. And that's her way of using the Xenophone as a tool of liberation and creative self-expression. However, there are different critiques of this, and the reason why I believe Roy is able to do this successfully and use the Xenophone successfully is because of her positionality. She had access to a colonial education, and so she's in proximity to colonial modes of thinking and modes of thought, and we will discuss that more later. So the next example of the Xenophone I will be discussing is Cathy Park Hong's Dance Dance Revolution. It is a book of poems, and it is written from the perspective of the guide who works in this simulation of different world cities known as the desert, and they speak a language known as desert creole. And it's very interesting because their accents portray who they talked to that day rather than their cultural roots. And so this tour guide walks us through these different simulacra or simulations of like famous world cities, and walks us through this very dystopian experience, and this world where language is not an accurate reflection of ethnicity or cultural identity. It's more so just a means for survival, the way the Xenophone is used in this book, which I'll talk more about later. So now we will be discussing this next question: how does one's positionality use the Xenophone either as a tool for oppression or liberation and emancipation from colonial binaries? So in Dance Dance Revolution, it is an extremely negative portrayal of the Xenophone. In Hong's DDR, in other words, Dance Dance Revolution, language is a commodity, and it shows that multilingualism and the Xenophone can emerge from political economic conditions of late capitalism. Language is a resource with exchange value, and it can be commodified and produced for basically the entertainment of tourists. So the guide in Dance Dance Revolution, her positionality forces her to use the Xenophone or Desert Creole to survive. So she's able to be a tour guide, and she uses different languages that are evolving and are kind of spliced together, and they don't reveal any true genuine form of cultural engagement or exchange because it's all commodified for tourism and global late-stage capitalism. And so the Xenophone, in this case, it uplifts and supports hegemonic cosmopolitanism, and that's why this desert place ardently protects and defends multilingualism and so-called multiculturalism because it's their way of making money. And so linguistic possibilities are contingent upon power structures, and it kind of goes beyond and eliminates the debate between monolingualism versus multilingualism. And the desert really reminds me of Dubai in this sense, because Dubai has a large expat community, but it relies on migrant labor and practically slave labor. And so even though Dubai, technically speaking, is a very diverse place with a bunch of different languages that are spoken there, ultimately it's for the benefit of those in power, and it relies upon migrant labor to like build the city of Dubai itself and to keep it functioning. And basically it's this place that's known for kind of being like luxuriant and like a Wizard of Oz type place, like larger than life. And for me, it's like a symbol of late-stage capitalism, and for me, the multiculturalism that it represents is rather dystopian, and it's a place I would never ever want to go to in my life. Now I'm going to be talking about Roy and how some may argue that she represents the post-colonial exotic. And for this reference, I'm going to be mentioning a book written by Graham Hugan, and within this book he talks about the postcolonial exotic and the marketing of the margins. And what he argues is that postcolonial literature and culture is marketed and consumed in the West, and he specifically criticizes the Booker Prize, which also happens to be the same prize that Roy was awarded for writing this book. and he states that literary prizes as we know them are best seen as a phenomenon of reflections of shifting patterns of patronage with an increasing emphasis on public sponsorship and, above all, as signs of the dominant role played by international industry as a legitimizing agent for literature and other arts. So the Booker Prize is kind of this arbiter of post-colonial literature, and Roy is kind of like the poster child for the post-colonial exotic in the way the Xenophone can be used as like a marketing tool and kind of further extending this sense of Orientalism, this fascination with the post-colonial other. And Roy, because of her positionality, she happens to benefit from her use of the Xenophone, and she's applauded and celebrated for her creative use of it by Western international audiences. But if you compare it to the speaker in Dance Dance Revolution, it's merely just a means of survival, something that she has to do and practice to get through her day-to-day life. And meanwhile, Roy, it's something that lends her cultural capital and authenticity and credibility in her works. And positionality, I think, really shapes how we understand the Xenophone and whether or not it's a tool for oppression or liberation. And so the Xenophone cannot be viewed as solely an optimistic thing. It's kind of like technology in itself. It's like neutral, but how it's used can really affect our understanding of ourselves and our sense of reality. And so the Xenophone, even though it is an apt description of the post-colonial languaging scene, how it's used is dependent on its context and the positionality of the speaker. Thank you.